Abdullah told Laiba that morning, "Even if you are dying, you must go down those stairs and wash the dishes." These were Abdullah's demands, even as his young wife Laiba was carrying his child and enduring immense pain. Her family never imagined that only hours later, they would find Laiba's life brutally ended, her body bearing signs of unimaginable violence. When her family arrived at the hospital, they saw what they never expected. Laiba, barely recognizable, with her throat slashed and her body bruised. She had been married for only a few months, but that short time had been filled with pain, control, and violence. This is Laiba's story, a young woman who was only 19 years old, trying to survive in a marriage that would ultimately become a nightmare. Today, I am sharing her family's words, the heartbreaking details of what happened behind closed doors, and the tragic outcome that they never thought possible. Who was Laiba? Laiba was just 19 years old, stepping into a new chapter of life with hopes and dreams for her future. As the youngest in her family, she was not only cherished, but deeply protected by her siblings. Losing her mother 3 years earlier had created a bond between Laiba and her sisters that went beyond typical sibling relationships. Her sisters became her closest confidants, sharing in her joys and sorrows, and offering guidance as she transitioned from childhood to adulthood. When Laiba married Abdullah, her family hoped this new chapter would bring happiness and stability. They saw her as someone who deserved a life filled with kindness and respect, and they trusted Abdullah to provide that. Laiba herself looked forward to her future, thinking she would have a loving partner to support her. However, things did not go as planned, and the story that unfolded was not the one she or her family had ever imagined. The marriage and early signs of trouble. Laiba entered her marriage with a sense of hope, trusting that Abdullah genuinely loved her and that this new life would bring her happiness. Like many young brides, she had dreams of a caring husband and a peaceful home. Her sisters remember how Abdullah seemed attentive before the wedding, portraying himself as someone who would look after Laiba with kindness and respect. However, those early promises began to unravel soon after the wedding. Not long into their marriage, Abdullah's personality began to change. The affection he had once shown faded, replaced by moods that Laiba's sisters described as harsh and cold. Her sisters saw how Laiba struggled, noticing bruises and marks on her that hinted at physical abuse. The emotional strain was clear too. Laiba's voice on the phone with her sisters grew quieter, and her usual lightheartedness was missing. What was supposed to be a safe, loving marriage quickly turned into a painful experience, filled with fear and isolation. Adding to the complexity, Laiba learned she was pregnant only 3 months into the marriage. Her pregnancy, which might have been a source of joy, instead heightened her feelings of entrapment. She now felt she had to think not only of her own safety, but also of her unborn child's future. Laiba's struggles within the household. Once Laiba moved into Abdullah's family home, the reality of her life there turned dark and exhausting. Despite her pregnancy and the fatigue that came with it, she was expected to shoulder all the household chores without any rest or understanding. Her sisters remember her mentioning how she would feel dizzy and weak, yet Abdullah showed little care for her condition. Instead of being concerned, he would expect her to continue cooking, cleaning, and fulfilling every demand of the household. There was no empathy, no concern for her well-being, only relentless pressure to do more. It was not just the physical strain. Laiba's mental health began to suffer severely as well. Abdullah's indifference grew into outright emotional manipulation. He used threats of divorce to keep her under control, warning her that he would leave her if she did not fulfill his expectations or dared to voice her discomfort. Laiba's access to others was also limited. Abdullah often isolated her from her family, even going so far as to put a lock on her phone, restricting her ability to reach out for help or comfort. Laiba's sisters could see the toll this was taking on her, both physically and emotionally. They described her as a shadow of her former self, worn down from the constant mistreatment and isolation. She was trapped in an environment where cruelty seemed to come daily, leaving her feeling entirely alone. Her sister's concern grew, realizing that the Laiba they once knew was slipping away, replaced by someone weighed down by fear and exhaustion. The investigation and family's plea for justice. In the aftermath of Laiba's death, her family, especially her sisters, has tirelessly demanded a thorough investigation. They believe the details of her case are far too suspicious to ignore and have been vocal about their suspicions that Laiba's death was no accident, nor was it a choice she made herself. Yet, despite the evident signs of abuse and manipulation, authorities initially considered the possibility of suicide, which left Laiba's family feeling frustrated and unheard. For Laiba's loved ones, this was not just an oversight by the authorities. It was a painful denial of Laiba's reality. Her family, who knew firsthand about the hardships she endured, is convinced that years of mistreatment at Abdullah's hands are what led to her tragic end. They see this case as a reflection of an ongoing issue where women facing abuse often go unheard, even when the signs are clear. To them, this is not only about getting justice for Laiba, but also about setting a precedent that abuse and cruelty cannot be dismissed. The family's demands are specific and firm. They are calling for Abdullah to be held accountable, as well as his mother, who has been absconding since the incident. Laiba's sisters have gone as far as to plead with higher authorities to step in and ensure that justice is served. They are determined to keep pushing, hoping that no one else will have to endure what Laiba did, and that her story will not be brushed aside, but treated with the seriousness it deserves. Reflections on Laiba's tragic death. Laiba's death has left her family shattered, especially her sisters, who are haunted by feelings of regret and helplessness. They have spoken about the constant pain they feel, wishing they had done more to protect her. They cannot shake the thought that, maybe, if they had intervened sooner or urged her to leave Abdullah's household, her life could have been saved. It is a sorrow that weighs heavily on them, intensified by the belief that Laiba suffered in silence, believing there was no way out. This tragedy reflects a sad truth that many women and families experience in societies where discussing abuse can bring shame or, worse, escalate the violence. Fear of judgment or retaliation often keeps women from speaking up, and this silence enables abusers to continue. Laiba's sisters want people to understand that abuse should never be accepted or ignored, regardless of the pressures or fears involved. They hope Laiba's story serves as a wake-up call, a reminder for families and communities to recognize the warning signs, offer support, and act before it is too late. This call for change, fueled by Laiba's story, carries a plea that no other woman endures what she did, and that intervention comes before the pain becomes irreversible. Laiba's life was full of dreams that never had a chance to come true. Her family is left with questions that may never be answered. What do you think about her tragic story? Share your thoughts. Like the video if it resonated, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The disturbing night of Laiba's death. The night Laiba lost her life was haunting and chaotic, a memory her family will never forget. Around 2:30 late night, Laiba's family was jolted awake by a phone call from Abdullah's father. His words were cold and alarming. He told them that an argument had broken out and they needed to come take Laiba home. It was an unusual hour for a call like this, and the distress in his voice hinted that something was terribly wrong. Only a few minutes later, before they could even make sense of what was happening, a second call came through. This time, from Abdullah himself. His tone was frantic, as he told them not to come to the house after all, but to go directly to the hospital. The shift in his instructions was confusing, but the urgency in his voice made Laiba's family fear the worst. They rushed to the hospital with a sense of dread filling every moment of that ride. When Laiba's family arrived at the hospital, their worst fears were confirmed. There, they found Laiba lying motionless, her body covered in brutal marks. She was gone. Her throat had been slashed, and bruises marked her skin, a silent testament to the violence she had suffered. The horrifying sight left her family in shock, their minds unable to grasp the cruelty she had endured in her final hours. In their grief, Laiba's sisters examined her body closely, looking for answers. One detail that stood out to them was the absence of defensive wounds on her hands. There were no signs that she had fought back, which left her family deeply unsettled. Abdullah had initially claimed that she had attacked him first, yet there was no evidence on her body to support this. Instead, the injuries suggested that she had been completely defenseless, caught off guard, and subjected to unimaginable brutality. For Laiba's family, this night marked the end of a battle she had fought silently and alone. The horrific details of her last moments became an unbearable burden for them, raising questions that would haunt them long after she was gone. Abdullah's conflicting stories and suspicions of murder. The days following following Laiba's death brought a wave of confusion, as Abdullah's explanations shifted and seemed increasingly contradictory. At first, he claimed that he had accidentally stabbed Laiba. The word accidentally seemed hollow, given the state of her body and the brutal wounds she had suffered. When questioned further, his story changed, and he alleged that Laiba had attacked him in a sudden fit of rage, forcing him to retaliate. In his attempt to justify what happened, Abdullah tried to paint Laiba as the aggressor. He went as far as accusing her of infidelity, suggesting that she had somehow provoked him that night. Yet, there was no evidence to support any of his accusations. To Laiba's family, these claims were both painful and absurd. They knew the kind of person Laiba was, someone who deeply valued her family and was excited to become a mother. Her sisters, especially, found Abdullah's accusations outrageous. They believed that Laiba was focused on building a future for her unborn child and would never have risked her life or her babies over an argument. For Laiba's family, especially her sisters, these excuses felt like Abdullah's attempt to evade responsibility. The inconsistencies in his statements, combined with the marks of violence on Laiba's body, left them with little doubt this was not an accident, nor a momentary lapse of control. Her family is convinced that this was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to silence Laiba and erase her presence. The heartbreak of her loss is compounded by this conviction, leaving her family to grapple, not only with their grief, but with a profound sense of injustice.